Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here. I'm holding my new little girl over here, so the volume may be a little bit different, but hopefully it's not bad for you all. We did do a sound check, so hopefully it's all going to work out okay. We'll see how this goes. But yeah, today we're taking a look at Goliath. This is our open beta review. However, I'm going to be honest, this is probably what the stats are going to end up looking like for the final set, only because when this was recorded, I'm recording this around the end of March. You guys will probably be seeing this around the middle of April. You guys might have your models by now, depending on how quickly they get out, the pre-orders. So just note that like a lot of the stuff that will happen in our full first edition review, for lack of a better name at the present moment, just know that it will probably will not change all that much. Although by the time I'm doing that review, we'll probably have some idea on what the siege tank is going to look like. So there will be some changes in how we discuss utility of it because we'll have more vehicles to go off of. The nice thing about this is it means straight out of the gate, there's a lot of different ways for you to play Terran in the RTS game. You can play bio pretty heavily and just lean a lot into your biological units coming out of the barracks. You can play standard mech, and of course, there is also kind of Sky Terran sort of approach as well, especially with StarCraft 2, when you start getting access to things like the Liberator, which you don't really have in StarCraft 1 or Brood War. However, it is worth noting that at the very least, while you cannot play probably full mech, it depends on how many points you're playing at. You probably can't play full mech per se. You might be able to play full mech over here, or at the very least, you'd be able to play pretty heavily into mech. And it's not a bad build because the Goliath as a starting point is actually a pretty good unit. And even as we go forward, because of the fact that it can take on both air and ground units, it at least has some utility for us going forward, even if the enemy ends up going with a lot of air units. And so taking a look, first of all, shout out to the OG Goliath from StarCraft 1. Pathing was horrific on this thing. It was not necessarily easy to use, but man, if you needed a way to back up your Marines and you wanted them to live a little bit longer, especially in the OG StarCraft where the medic didn't exist yet, uh, firepower from a Goliath was not a bad idea. It certainly helped a bit having those. But again, we're going to be talking about the stats, special rules, what's going on here. There's going to be a lot going on here because, as you can see, just looking at the picture, there's a lot of weapon systems on the Goliath. And so there's going to be a lot of different kinds of abilities and stuff that you can use. And there's a lot of special rules by virtue of how tall this thing is and various and sundry other stuff. So just know that's going to be a longer section than normal, I think, when we're talking about those. Then we're going to talk about its offensive and defensive abilities. We're going to talk about the role that it fills in your army, whether or not it is consistent with what we see in StarCraft 1 and then in the campaign side of StarCraft 2, because of course you can't play them in standard play, and then answering the all-important question, should you buy it? Though you should know in advance, before I talk about any of these things, that the Goliath is one of my 3 favorite Terran units in the RTS game, up there with the Diamondback tank and the lowly Marine. So just be aware, personal bias may come into play. And if it does, I'm sorry, but I honestly think I'm trying to keep it pretty objective. So I guess we'll find out. And so when taking a look at this, see, I told you there was a lot going on. There's a lot going on this card. It actually required me to do some formatting to even try to show it to you. We don't have any of the cool fancy cards available for us right now in open beta. And there were some changes from the older cards that we had. So I didn't want to, simply use the old one and go with it. But just suffice to say off the top, speed looks really high by comparison to other things, but that's because it's a solo model, right? So keep in mind that they're kind of also trying to make up for the fact that it doesn't have the ability to then place another model within 3 inches or 4 inches or whatever of them. So just note that that's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit higher, but other units are actually technically moving faster than these. That being said, it's still plenty fast enough to mostly keep up with the units that you're running at a speed of 7. It does not get access to an evade save. So just note you will not be able to evade things. That does actually come up with a rule elsewise, but just know that there's no evade save on this unit. It does have a 4+ armor, which is perfectly fine, and it is at 10 hit points. Now, it used to be at as high as 12 at one point. It's down to 10 now, which honestly I think is still fine. I mean, it's still perfectly reasonable. This is also the same hit points that a queen has. You do get access to cards that can give you heal 2 actions, so like it's not bad in terms of having these. Just know that it used to be a little bit higher, it's a little bit lower now, which I think is fine. There was quite a bit of people using Goliath, and I think the feedback was it's a little too healthy. Maybe drop it back just a smidge. It has a size of 3, which doesn't sound that important, but what it means is one, it's actually really difficult to hide these things. So you are going to be using them very aggressively. You can't really just pull away, hide behind stuff, and hope that it's going to protect you, unless you're playing on specific boards that have a lot of size 3 and size 4 terrain. In which case, then you might be able to hide them, and you can kind of take advantage of ambushing enemies as they have to come around in order to try to get to you. But just know that, like, up front, it is not particularly easy to hide them, and definitely not as easy as it is for a lot of the other stuff we've seen so far in this series. It has a starting supply of 2, so you can't put out quite as many of these, or obviously nearly as many models if you end up putting out a lot of Goliaths early on. That being said, the fact that it's a 1 model unit also means it will maintain that 2 supply for the purpose of objective control until you remove all 10 wounds, which a lot of supply 2 models so far in the game do not have. So that is quite nice. And it also means that, when looking at it from a squad perspective, for the footprint on it, it has an incredibly high supply rating, right? So, you have to get relatively close into it because you have to draw your distance to that specific model instead of, a unit of zealots that might be spread out a little bit more. And thus, from a footprint perspective, might be larger in order to hit that supply 2 unit. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to how this is built out, but suffice it to say, I think honestly it's excellent so far. It has the armored keyword, mechanical keyword. Well, both of those make sense, and of course it's a ground unit because it's on the ground. Okay, and then when looking at the movement phase, it has the target lock ability. Now this is in a 1 CP active ability that you can pop that is really nice, especially if you have multiple Goliaths in your army, and if you keep those Goliaths together, which in the RTS game is mostly how we used Goliaths, right? They weren't particularly good just one-offs. You really want to have a couple of them all grouped together so you can defend against every threat. And the way this target lock works is that you select an enemy unit within 12 inches, and whenever a friendly Goliath unit, any friendly Goliath unit, which could be this unit itself or additional ones, whenever they target that enemy with an autocannon, which is your primary attack, that weapon gains Surge Light and Surge Armored. So it surges against everything except maybe a structure. I want to say structures don't have that, but that's great because there aren't very many of those so far. And their Surge Dice is a D3 plus 1. Now, this is important because the autocannon does not innately have a surge result. Okay, it doesn't have a surge type and it doesn't have a surge die, as you'll soon see in like 15 seconds. And so the result is being able to have this, but not only just have this, but to be able to have it by spending 1 CP for potentially multiple Goliaths. This is really, really nice. And you can you can set this up by choosing a unit within 12 inches of Goliath number 1. And then in the rest of the move phase, you can move Goliath number 2, Goliath number 3, possibly even Goliath number 4 or 5. We don't currently have a way to get more than 5 into an army, and that does assume a 2,000 point standard gameplay. So I guess if you were higher than 2,000 points, you might be able to get that. But just suffice it to say, at least in standard play, 2,000 points or lower, you aren't going to have more than 5. But hypothetically, you could get a unit up to 5 people all getting a really nice surge type that they weren't paying nearly as many points for in their base profile by only spending 1 command point, which is really nice. It would require you to set that up by making sure that you have your Goliaths all in one space and be a whole lot of your army all in one space. But just suffice it to say, you can technically get all of that on a bargain, which is really nice. When looking at the assault phase, you've got, of course, the autocannon, which has a reasonable range at 12 inches. It's got 9 attacks with a 4+ to hit. So you're getting 4 to 5 hits, only doing damage 1. But if you do have that surge of D3 plus 1, that's 2 to 4 of them. They're going to bypass armor saves, which is really, really nice. It does have long range as well, so it can reach out even further, assuming, of course, that you're not hit by a flare from medics or things like that. And toward that end, by the way, the medic is going to be the number 1 bane for Goliaths. Because if they can flare against a Goliath and the Goliath isn't able to get that blocked, then you're going to be you're not going to do very much in a given turn. Okay. But you also have a second weapon. This is the underbelly machine gun, and it also shoots at ground targets and it has the sidearm special rule, which means you can use it alongside other weapons. So you can use it alongside your autocannon every single turn, which is really, really nice. It has a much shorter range and it doesn't have the long range option. So, you're going to have to be attacking things that are pretty close to you. But it does get 6 shots with a 3+, which is on average about 4 hits, which is actually about the same as the autocannon, right? You know, the autocannon has a higher ceiling, but it's about as reliable as that one, and it starts with a surge result, so that's not bad at all. And it does have the pinpoint special rule. Pinpoint is relatively rare, but what this means is typically when a unit is engaged in close combat, the only unit that can shoot at that unit in the assault phase, you know, a unit that's charged in, is the unit that was charged. Pinpoint allows you to fire into a combat because you're not worried about hitting your own people because it has pinpoint accuracy. So this is kind of a nice thing for Terran specifically because Terran units, just as a general rule, are pretty darn bad in close combat. We'll see how the Fire Bat does come the end of the year because Fire Bats with their flamethrowers might actually have a pretty reasonable attack in close combat, and that might be your answer to close combat units, which they also are in the RTS game. So that could be really nice. You also have Hellfire missiles. The Hellfire missiles are flying only, so they're useful against flyers, although more on that when we look at upgrades in a little bit. It has a 16-inch range, which is great. It has, again, the same 6 shots with the 3+, so it's going to be on average 4 hits, and also surging against light targets, which I anticipate a lot of the early on flying units are going to be. We know we're going to be getting things like Mutalisks, which are likely to be light targets. We're going to be getting things like Scouts, which are likely to be light targets. Right, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of light. I feel like the Banshee counts as, it might be light. My brain was telling me for a moment there that it counts as armored. It might be. I don't know. Actually, I have to go look that up. But, as regards all of those, I think we're going to get a lot of use out of that surge result early on, which is kind of great. And it has anti-evade 1, which I anticipate that flying units in general are going to have a pretty good evade save. That's just my guess. In fact, if anything, they might even have special rules that because they're flying units, maybe they just always get to perform an evade save. So being able to reduce basically increase the difficulty of that evade save by an extra +1, so more of them are likely to fail, is really, really nice. And the fact that this also has sidearm means that, like the Goliath in StarCraft 1 and like the upgraded version that you can get in the campaign of StarCraft 2, you can fire at air units and ground units at the same time. Right? You're effectively able to fire all 3 of these weapons every single turn as long as you have a mix of ground and flying units within range of you. Okay? There are ways to use these missiles against ground targets. We'll talk about those more when we end up looking at the upgrades section. For those who are chomping at the bit and jumping ahead, because we got some interesting weapon upgrades that are coming on the next slide. Before we get there, though, there are 3 more things we need to talk about. The first is the Indomitable rule. This is actually a really important rule. It says that while it's engaged, this unit can target units that are unengaged with it, which is typically not allowed. So you can still use it to protect your own stuff even if you get charged, which is really nice. And it also means that it can be targeted by units that are not the unit assaulting it. Typically, you aren't allowed to shoot into a combat, right? But because this unit is, I anticipate, so tall, and I think that's part of the reason why it has this rule, and that so much of what's at the bottom is just the legs, right? So it's not particularly important stuff for the purposes of the shooting aspect or the being shot at aspect. It means that people can still pile in their shots from roaches, from hydralisks, while you're engaged with a unit of zerglings. That could be quite dangerous, especially if you've got shredding claws on those zerglings. So that's just something to think about. It does have the little throwaway line at the end that in both cases, the defending unit gains an evade roll against those attacks. Just keep in mind that you are giving an evade save to any unit that you're shooting at that you're not engaged with when you're engaged, and you are not actually getting the benefit of an evade save because you don't have an evade save. Remember how we talked about that earlier? This is where it comes up being very important. You are giving an evade save to your opponent's unit while not really getting one yourself. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I think it's fine. If nothing else, it brings down the cost. And since this thing is starting just up like 200, I think that that's actually pretty nice to have in there. But just suffice it to say, that is something that you're going to need to work on, and just something that you're going to need to plan around. In addition to that, we have Devastating Charge. Now, this sounds really good, and in general, it is really good as regards the units that are present for us. Oops, sorry, skipped on a little bit faster there. The nice thing about Devastating Charge is that at least if you're going to successfully charge into a unit, you get 4 impact hits on a 3+, which means on average you're doing between 2 and 3 hits to the enemy, which is really nice. The problem is a couple of things. Number one, unlike a lot of other units that get bonuses to impact hits and things like that, one, you don't have the ability to, roll 2 dice, take the higher for your charge distance, which admittedly also is why this doesn't have a command point cost attached to it, which is actually kind of nice. But the other issue is that when we look at the combat phase, your combat attacks are horrible. Okay. You get 4 attacks on a 5+, no surge, only doing 1 damage. That is not good. You're getting on average 1, maybe 2 wounds in close combat. So just know that if you are charging into something, you better have a really good reason for doing it, or it needs to be a really tiny unit, right? Like, maybe there's a unit of medics that's around, and for whatever reason you didn't feel like shooting at them. I don't even know why you wouldn't want to shoot at them because, again, that's what this thing is built for. But let's just say you wanted to charge in, then maybe your impact hits are going to end up doing a wound or maybe even 2 past them. But again, like how many, like even if they have 3 medics when you first start, right? It's a full squad of medics. You're going to get them down to what, 2 medics left by the end of your impact hits? And then it's going to take you, I kid you not, like 3 turns to get rid of them, right? So like I feel like there's almost no situation where you're going to use devastating charge unless there's like literally 2 zerglings, right? Or something like that, and you feel like you can remove both of them by running them over. I still feel like you're probably better shooting at them and just using like your underbelly machine gun to shoot at them, and then you use your autocannons to shoot at something else. So I just wonder about the whole charging thing. It is slightly more reliable, I suppose, for getting rid of things, especially maybe if they're, I don't know, burrowed or something like that. So they're getting an evade save against everything. I don't know, but even then the evade save is going to affect your impact hits, as far as I can tell. So, like, I like it technically exists. I almost wish it didn't have the devastating charge rule because then it would probably be slightly cheaper, maybe 10 points off or something like that. Which every now and then I do need an extra 10 points somewhere in the list. So, I don't know, man. You do what you want. Just know that, like a lot of the Terran stuff we have so far, uh, charging is not good, and fighting close combat is generally not good. You're generally better off just shooting. And when looking at upgrades, we got a couple of things going on. So first of all, there's the one that I basically take every single time, which is just the Ares class targeting system. For 20 points, you give your ground-based weapons precision 1. Right, the autocannon and the underbelly machine gun are both going to gain precision 1. Now, this is very important for both of those guns because, and I'm going to go ahead and just jump back really quick and go show you what those look like in terms of profile. So one of them is a 9 attacks on a 4+, which again is an average of 4 to 5 hits. Now, if you have precision 1 on that as a static passive, you don't have to pay any CPs to trigger that. It's not triggered by any specific conditions. Just anytime you fire, you get precision 1. And precision 1 means you get to convert one failed hit into a hit, which means now on average, we're not hitting with 4 or 5, we're hitting with 5 or 6, which is really nice because one of the ones that's a miss didn't miss. And then when it comes to the underbelly machine gun, on average with a 3+, we're getting 4 hits, but we can get that easily closer to 5 hits because one of the 2 misses is now no longer a miss. So it's going to bring us a lot closer to our ceiling for only 20 points, which is really not bad. And when you consider how many turns you're probably going to be shooting with at least the autocannon, if not also the underbelly machine gun, I think this is a really, really good opportunity here. And so, with the knowledge that that's just going to make all of these things a lot more reliable, all of that is just honestly really good. Now, there are 2 other upgrades that you can take, and these are basically upgrades on your missile launchers, on the Hellfire missiles. And both of them, as you notice, they target ground units, which is really nice for us here at the beginning because it means that our 3 weapon attack system that currently can't really shoot at any air units because we don't really have any air units, all things considered. This does give you the ability to now use that 3rd weapon system to attack a ground unit, but you have to spend 30 to 40 points in order to make the upgrade. Now, I am one of those people who, when I look at it, I'm not saying there isn't a reason to take either of these. There is, right? Namely, you're turning a 2 weapon system into a 3 weapon system, and one of them has an innate surge against light, and one of them has an innate surge against armor, and they have some really nice keywords. Do keep in mind, if you're on a budget and you don't have a lot of points lying around, like the Goliath is a fine anti-ground unit without either of these if you're using target lock, because then you get surge against light and armored with a D3+1 with 9 attacks on a 4+, very possibly with precision 1, because again, I never leave home without the Ares class targeting system. That's the one I always take. Now, that being said, it is worth working through the next 2 upgrades because they have their uses. I'm not convinced that they're like absolutely necessary, and I am definitely not convinced that they are equal. I tend to find I take the haywire missiles way more often than I take the scatter missiles. And so let's take a look, actually, in these in reverse order. We'll take a look at the haywire first, and then we'll take a look at scatter. So first of all, the haywire missiles, they have a 12-inch range, which is nice. They attack ground units with only 3 attacks, but it's a 3 plus. So you're hitting with about 2 of those. And it's armor, and it has surge against armored targets D3, so, which means that there's a very high chance you're turning both of those hits into wounds, no armor save. And a lot of vehicles have pretty bad evade saves if they get to use the evade save at all, which means against armored targets, you're actually going to sneak quite a few of those in. But in addition, and this is nice, it has the Pierce armored keyword. And what Pierce means is you replace that damage of 1 with the number in the parentheses for every hit you do if it's going up against the target, whatever that keyword is. So while, yes, you're only doing 2 hits on average, if it's against a light target, you're doing 2 hits, they get a full armor save, and if anything goes through, it does a damage of 1, which is not particularly great, though again, it is still a sidearm, so you do get to use it in addition to your autocannons and your underbelly machine gun. But if you are able to shoot at an armored target, well, now you've got 3 attacks, 2 of those are likely to hit, and then you're likely to surge for both of those, and both of those are doing 3 damage. That's 6 damage against an armored target, which is really nice. And that means if you have 2 of these guys hanging out with haywire missiles shooting at the same thing, there's a very good chance that unless they can get an evade save, you're just going to wipe out an armored unit so far in this game. Because 6 is enough to remove a marauder unless you've got, a medic save nearby. That's the one thing. 6 is enough to wipe out half of a roach squad unless they've got a queen nearby. Which means if you have 2 of those, 12 is enough to remove a 2-man marauder squad and a full roach squad if they don't have a save hanging out. So pretty powerful, right? Especially considering that, again, you're using this alongside your autocannons for the turn, which might also be surging against armored targets. So who knows? You might not need to use multiple Goliaths against something, depending on how it all works out, how the math all works out. And you also get the underbelly machine gun. So, like, you're doing a lot. For an extra 40 points, I think this is well worth it. For only 250 points, if you just had the Ares class targeting system and the haywire missiles on the base chassis, that's really, really solid. Now, there is an argument to be said for saving yourself 10 points and instead going for the scatter missiles. Now, this one is a little more involved because, as you notice, it has a lot more keywords and it has a weirder and wonkier hit ability. It has an 18-inch range, and it has a long range of up to 24, which is really nice, okay? It only shoots against ground targets and has a base attack of 6 with a 5+ to hit, which means on average you're only hitting with 2 of those. But since it surges on a light D3, if you're shooting at a light target, both of those hits are likely to become wounds, unless they get an evade save, which is really nice. It only does 1 damage each, so it's not dramatic. But if you're shooting at a Marine squad that has already popped a stim pack, then the 1 to 2 wounds that you end up sneaking through, depending on how much you surge for and things like that, is actually pretty likely to remove multiple Marines, only because you're going to trigger those non-lethal wounds, right? Which is really nice. However, it actually gets slightly better than this if the keywords work out. So for starters, it's indirect fire, which means you can shoot at things you can't see, which is actually quite nice. So, even though it has that 5+ to hit, I suspect this is partially why it has that 5+ to hit, is because you can technically shoot at any unit that's within range, even if they're behind stuff. So that is really, really nice. But in addition, it has the locked-in keyword, and the locked-in keyword means that if you're firing at a stationary unit, you add an additional 6 attacks. Now, you might tell yourself, okay, in the advent of the siege tank, the swarm host, etc., like, how many stationary targets are you actually likely to find? And that is a good question. However, it is actually slightly easier to trigger this locked-in ability where you're shooting at stationary targets because, per the rules, when it starts in the movement phase, it has the stationary keyword, which means they don't actually lose that keyword until they perform a movement. So let's say, for example, you've got a Marine squad and they're guarding an objective and they activate and they do stim, but they don't actually move. they're a stationary target. And they won't have an opportunity to remove that unless one, they either give up their shot in the assault phase to perform a movement action, or they end up just eating the fact that now you're shooting at them with 12 dice instead of shooting at them with 6 dice, which now on average is 4 hits, which means you can even take advantage of a full D3 on the surge, and then potentially trigger all of those stim hits as well. So like there's a lot you can potentially do with that. It's really kind of forcing opponents to move around, which in a primarily objective based game is actually really really nice. So again, I'm not saying that like the scatter missiles are horrific. I personally think that the 5+ means you're gonna have a really swingy times with shooting, which is not particularly great. I like things being a little more reliable. But I mean, if you like having high ceilings and you want to be able to throw potentially 12 dice on scatter missiles and 9 dice on auto cannons and another 6 dice on the underbelly machine gun. That is a lot more shots than any unit currently in the game gets, and that includes Marine squads, which have really, really good volume. So, like again, I'm not saying any of these upgrades are bad. I tend to leave the scatter missiles at home just because it's a little more positionally and tactically requiring and demanding, and it tends to rely on my opponent making decisions instead of me making decisions, which I generally tend to avoid when it comes to list building. So then when looking at the offensive abilities of it, obviously this is an offense-focused machine, right? I mean, this is most of what it does, right? In the movement phase, you get target lock, which is a really good way of setting up both the Goliath and potentially multiple other Goliaths later on a budget, which is really, really nice. In the assault phase, you get really swingy multi-target damage. Okay, so the 4+ to hit on that 9 attacks could be really good or it could be really bad, right? I mean, you could be anywhere around 3 hits, which is not great, to 9 hits, which is pretty awesome. Though how often 9 is actually going to happen is an excellent question, right? On a 4+ to hit. And you can potentially surge against anything with a D3 plus 1, which is really nice, assuming that you get off that target lock and you're willing to spend that CP, which in most cases is going to be worth it, just to make sure you're sneaking in those hits. So it can be really effective with the autocannon, but it really all depends. The second thing to consider is you got that underbelly machine gun, right? And this is only 6 attacks, and it's got a pretty short range at 8 inches. But one, there's quite a few melee focused and even 8-inch range units in the game so far. You got stuff like roaches, you've got zerglings, you've got zealots. So there are quite a few things that are going to be closing to 8 inches of you anyway. And there's quite a few things that are going to want to be within 12 inches that you can then move toward after they've already moved and set themselves up. So that way they would be within range, right? And so like, you've got some options for how you work those. You also do have the pinpoint rule, which do not forget about is really nice. I generally tend to save my underbelly machine gun and tend to wait to activate Goliaths until I know whether or not another unit has been successfully charged so that I can kind of winnow down that unit with a Goliath unit on account of the fact that they probably, when planning out, okay, is it safe to charge or not, they were probably thinking one-on-one with the unit in question. Right. And in as much as that's the case, it is really, really nice to be able to then say, okay, well, now I'm going to change the math in ways you may not have expected, possibly even before that unit ends up doing even its return fire. Right. And so because of that, that can be just really advantageous for you. You've then got the Hellfire missiles, which again is really good against, air units, can be good for attacking ground units, can be really swingy, or it could just be a few reliable anti-armor hits, and then you're just hoping that there's no evade save. It all depends again on how you end up working that out. But in general, like it's good with that weapon system, regardless of how you have it kitted out. And so it's a really good multi-unit counter, right? I mean, you can shoot at 2 to 3 units per turn. Pretty effective against pretty much everything, all things considered. Obviously, we're going to have much better anti-armor and probably anti-light, honestly, damage when the siege tank rolls around in the next wave of releases. But at least for now, it's pretty good, right? I mean, it's pretty reliable, right? It's not nearly as skewed one way or the other as Marines and Marauders are toward fighting light units or armored units. So that's really nice to have. And while you technically have the impact hits, just don't do it. There's almost no situation where you would want to actually do it. Unless you needed the spot where the unit was and you needed to just tromp them down so you can remove them from the table and take their spot near an objective or something like that. And then in the combat phase, again, it's pretty bad. So while this is generally an offense-focused sort of unit, offense in the combat phase, not so much. It's not very good at that at all. In fact, it's barely better than a medic, right? I mean, medics will cost roughly half to maybe 2/3 of the cost. Could potentially be rivaling the cost of a Goliath. And they're getting 3 attacks on a 5+ doing damage 1, no search. So, especially for cost, it's horrible. In general, in the game, this is one of the worst close combat profiles in the game we've seen so far. And honestly, I think that's pretty fair because again, it's so dominant in the ranged assault phase side of things. I feel like if they also made it good in close combat, it might actually be too powerful. So when looking at defensive abilities, we've got a couple of things going on. First of all, it's got reasonable maneuver abilities, right? I mean, it's got seven, speed of seven, which is pretty reasonable, right? And it's relatively easy to get to attack positions. And the fact that it's size three means it can move over things that other things cannot, right? So most notably, you've got those protective shields for the what's it called? For the sentries. You can move over those and remove them because of the fact that you're size three, which I don't think you can actually do in the RTS game, but it's kind of awesome. Good thing to do. It's not like that really hurts you all that much with Terran because currently there aren't really a lot of like melee focused Terran. But if people are trying to screen you off of an objective, it's really nice to be able to say, no, I think I would prefer to come through here. Thank you very much. And so don't sleep on that. It is a nice ability. You then also have, in the assault phase, like you have the ability to shoot potential dangers. And this is kind of the nice thing about it, because of the fact that you have pretty high hit points, you've got a 4+ armor save, which is really nice, and the ability to fire both in and out of combat means, unlike some units, it's not like the Goliath has to be your first activation in the assault phase, right? Because even if let's say you choose to activate a Marine unit or a Marauder unit, both of which really benefit from going well before they suffer a lot of wounds. And in the case of Marauders, you really want them to be firing at their armored target of choice and not a unit that's assaulting them, right? That may be a light unit, and thus you may be a lot less effective at removing those when shooting back. The nice thing about the Goliath is you can put it off for a couple of actions if you really want to. Because worst case scenario, they unleash with all of those attacks against something that charges into them. Worst case scenario, you shoot at that same unit after you've been engaged, and maybe they get an evade save, right? So it's really not that bad. I think it works out pretty okay. And I think in general, it means that this is going to be the dominant defensive ability, is really just removing firepower that could be hurting you and or the rest of your friends. And then the combat phase, honestly, and this is unfortunate, the only defensive ability I can really mention is try to fight first. Try to remove a model, maybe two, and that assumes one wound models, right? If you're fighting zealots, you're very unlikely to remove anything unless you got them down like one wound. But at the very least, it means you won't suffer quite as many wounds. Though again, it's not the kind of fight you need to necessarily activate first, right? Because you are relatively durable. You're going to get your full complement of attacks until you lose your very last wound. So it might be better to activate something like, say, a Marine unit, for example, because you will lose Marines pretty quickly in close combat. You might consider attacking with them first and just trying to remove as many people off of that close combat as you possibly can. And then from there, you move on, right? And so again, a really strong attack roll. There really isn't a lot of defensive abilities beyond just the base stat line, though admittedly, the base stat line is pretty good. So I would anticipate, especially if you get into close combat, you are going to look a little bit more like the guy on the right-hand side for the StarCraft 2 Goliath, where you got a nice little scar going on. You are pretty likely to take some damage when you're in close combat. And so in looking at the role that this thing fills, first of all, you've got a lot of multi-target damage, right? Which is really, really nice. It is reasonably durable, at least so far. Obviously, we haven't seen things like the Immortal, the Siege Tank. We haven't seen any of the really, really big stuff. But, for where we are right now, 10 wounds, even down from 12, even still at 10, it's pretty good. Okay, it's pretty good. And then, it has 2 supply until destroyed, which is really nice. So it's really great for taking and holding objectives because you can clear the enemy out of objectives. Heck, you can drop people down to 0 supply, so they aren't even helping, even though they're all around it and taking up space, while still being 2 up until your very last wound, right? Which is really, really nice. It is really good when hunting in packs because, again, you can spend target lock on one of them to benefit a lot of them. So this is the kind of unit where if you put 2 or 3 of them in the same spot, not only will you just, dominate objectives that are in the area, but you will remove quite a few things that are in the area and make it so that you can then start spreading out and you'll be in a really good position. There is one thing that is worth noting, which is that the supply can cause deployment issues, right? Because especially if you're playing at lower points games and you may only have a starting supply of like 4, like you might want to have a squad of Marines out. You might want medics to help out those Marines. You might want Marauders to keep away charging units, at which point it could be a couple turns before you can get out a Goliath. The alternative is you may start with 2 Goliaths out so they can headhunt together as a pack. but then it's going to take you forever to get out your bigger Marine squads. It's going to take you forever to get out, other stuff. You may be able to start with a medic squad out there with them, but the medic won't be able to help other than flare, which admittedly is a really nice form of help. But, again, like the supply thing can cause issues. Okay. If you're playing at larger scales, if you're playing standard play where you tend to get somewhere between 4 and 6, but typically closer to that 5 to 6 side of things, it is a lot easier to get out a Goliath squad. If you're playing at even larger battles, if you're playing, grand campaign style stuff where you have over 2,000 points, it might be even easier to get these things out. But just in general, my thinking on it is, yeah, like that's going to be one of the major issues, which admittedly in the core game, that's also one of the issues, right? You build a supply depot or two, you build a couple Goliaths, you're already again at supply limit, right? And that is actually pretty nicely reflected here within the tabletop game. And so does this match the computer game? Well, it's a solid ranged attacker against both ground and air. It may not be quite as good as other stuff, but like, I've played Wings of Liberty. I intentionally, went the full, Agria colonist line up until, you get the Goliath really early on. And then I just played the entire rest of the campaign. I've probably done Wings of Liberty like 25, 30 times at this point, by the way. I should probably mention that up front. I played it the entire rest of the game just building Goliaths. Like I didn't even build barracks units after that point. I just did it where I was just building Goliaths. And the fun story is you can actually win with just Goliaths. Even going all the way to the end and doing all in, you can do it with Goliaths. As long as you clear the top landing and you don't have air units coming after you, because Goliaths are great working against Nidus Worms. They're not particularly great working against Brood Lords. So, just things to think about. They're reasonably durable. They're not like a true heavy unit per se, but like they're reasonably durable. Especially if they're going up against the lighter targets, the earlier on sort of stuff in the tech tree. They're going to do just fine. It's a very capable infantry support vehicle, right? They're not particularly fast, but they move at around the same speed as your infantry, which is perfectly fine. So they'll keep pace with them, which is really good. And they can fire multiple weapon platforms at once, just like they can in the game. And so, in terms of asking, does this do what we anticipate it to do? The answer is, yeah. This is actually a really nice way to bring it over from the RTS game. If anything, it might even be a little more durable than I expected it to be. So I'm not going to complain about that because again, this is top 3 favorite Terrans for me. Have very, very fond experiences and fond memories with the Goliath. I just love this thing. And I'm glad that it's making an appearance so early on in the game. I get to play with it for my entire StarCraft experience here on the tabletop. So should you buy this thing? Yeah. You should buy more than one. Okay, you should get a lot of these. It's a very good suppression tool. It's a good removal tool. And again, depending on how you kit it out, you can have up to 3 weapon systems firing reliably every single turn. You could potentially be forcing your opponent to be making moves instead of just hanging out, in a really, really good spot. It is arguably a better objective holder than Marines because even though Marines technically have more wounds, and even when you factor in like their 5+ armor save by comparison to the 4+ armor save for these guys, they're probably still a little bit beefier and tankier. And that precision 3 makes them a better kind of support weapon. The problem is once you lose 3 models, which is only 6 wounds past a 5+ save, possibly another 5+ save, depending on whether you can proc that evade save, and actually get that to come up, you're down to supply 1, right? Like that's the problem. Whereas you have to do 9 wounds past a 4+ armor save. So on average, that's 18 wounds in order to still have him at supply 2, right? Like that's the nice thing about it. You have to do 10 wounds, 20 hits in order to actually remove it and thus get him down from supply 2. And he drops straight from supply 2 to supply 0. So, it means that, yeah, as you start taking wounds on this thing, it's not like you can start bringing on more of your reserves. That's kind of the nice thing about the bio side of things for Terran, is that as you start losing models, you do get to bring in more models, right? You get to bring in more units from reserve. I think if you're trying to hold an objective and you're really trying to do stuff, your volume of fire is great for this thing. It's better, especially if you get one of the missile upgrades. It's going to be better than your Marines are even giving, which is really high volume. They're doing like 18 shots on a 9-man squad, which is really nice. 18 shots is as much as like, the autocannon, the underbelly machine gun, plus a little bit extra from something else, right? So you're getting pretty close to, the same volume or higher volume, sometimes much higher volume coming here from the Goliath, and you're not going to be giving up that, so that objective anytime soon, right? Which is really great. If you play it right, it can also completely remove the need for Marauders. It's an expensive way to remove the need for Marauders, but once you start tacking on the upgrades, especially if you're taking a four-man Marauder squad, which is admittedly probably the best thing Terrans have right now for armor removal, and probably until the siege tank arrives, honestly. Um, Even then, like Goliaths, especially Goliaths hunting in packs, if you have two of them in a given area, Goliaths hunting in packs will be perfectly serviceable. They're perfectly serviceable against armor because not only does target lock give them reliable surge, admittedly doing, just a couple wounds at a time. Though again, it's not like Marauders are doing, damage three or anything like that. But then, you combine that with something like, say, the Haywire missiles, and you can completely remove the need to take Marauders at all, right? Because not only are you getting precision one on the autocannon and the underbelly machine gun in order to help you get reliable hits in, you're now doing pierce three against armored targets, potentially getting on average two of those, but a reasonable chance at getting three of those in. Like you can pop armor really quick. It doesn't take very long. Okay. And so in general, like I feel like as an element in your army, this is if you want to play Terran mech, this is a good start to Terran mech. You can be really good against light targets, really good against against armored targets, really good against air, really good against ground. Like you can do it all. And I mean, just look at it, right? Like this is just the front box art on this thing. It looks dope, right? I mean, it looks really good. And so, like, pick some up. They're available on pre-order right now. They're still in stock, so like, pick them up because these are really, really good models, and you will get a lot of work out of them. Plus, like, obviously, I haven't seen any behind the scenes for assembly on these. My experience with the Zeratul model is that assembly is actually relatively easy to do with these, which is great. The instructions are really clean, they're really good, and again, I haven't seen it exactly, but it feels like this is going to be a really great kit. The details on it are fantastically good. I think there's going to be a lot of just really, really beautiful paint jobs we're going to be able to do with these, and they're going to do really good work for you on the board. So if I may, make a humble pitch for a unit that I am biased in favor of, go out and get yourself some Goliaths. They're really, really nice. Even if you don't intend to play a lot of Terran, um, if you were planning on playing just at like 1,000 points, you could just pick up like a box of Marines and like three of these, and you might actually do okay. That's kind of the crazy thing about Goliath. You might actually do okay in a given game. You don't even need to invest too much into Terran in order to get a reliable army at the lower points levels. At higher points levels, I mean, you probably want some medics. Just because if nothing else, you don't want to be flared by somebody else's medics. So you might want some of those. Marauders are really nice. So again, it depends on how you want to kit these Goliaths out. If you take multiple Goliaths, you can give them different loadouts. You can take advantage of scatter missiles versus haywire missiles versus maybe no missile upgrades to take them a little bit cheaper. Like, there's a lot of different things you can do, but just suffice it to say, I think there's a lot of value to be had by picking these up. So you should consider adding these to your army. But what do you think? And first of all, are you just a bio only person? You're the kind of person who wants to go full bio, full send with just Marines, medics, Marauders, maybe ghosts down the line. And so because of that, you're just like, yeah, Goliath, not that interested. Are you the kind of person who's always loved the Goliath? You use them a lot in StarCraft 1, and you're just really excited. The pathing's better now. They can move to where they need to get a lot more reliably. They don't have nearly as many trouble going down ramps, among other things. I'm not gonna lie, that was frustrating. Like it's not Dragoon frustrating, but it's frustrating. Hated that so much. But maybe you're just really excited that you get to move this thing where you want it to go and it goes there every single time. Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.